everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be my upgraded list of the top 10 best ever movie villains of the 1980s. Which characters were amongst the most iconic screen antagonists for what, for me and for a lot of movie fans, still is the best ever movie decade. Now I will try and avoid spoilers when I can for the movies that these villains feature in, but you can also check out the list within the description if you indeed haven't yet seen the movies that we will be going through. So we then go on to the first entry on this list, and that is Ivan Drago from Rocky IV, played in 1985 by Dolph Lundgren in his debut performance, and his character very much represented the ultimate challenge for Rocky. He was either the irresistible force or the immovable object, freakishly tall, powerful, strong and athletic. This was raising the stakes even further for the Rocky character, who we had seen recently lose the title and regain it from Clubber Lang in the third installment. So Drago's presence is really the next evolution of the Rocky saga, requiring the hero to be at his absolute peak in order just to challenge Drago. We get all of the early scenes involving Drago, where we see him testing the resistance levels on the punch pads. We have all of the montages with all of his technique and training methods, using all the up-to-date equipment, and they clearly went for this more Terminator cyborg-like personality, with his limited dialogue, very thick accent and delivery. We have the iconic line, of course, if he dies, he dies. We have his epic ring entrance to his army of supporters in a climatic fight against Rocky, and everything is done here to present this ultimate destructive force. And whilst he doesn't have a personality, the sheer awe and power of his presence is very much hard to deny, and that's definitely what you would need for an iconic villain of any saga, let alone one of the greatest ever movie sagas in the Rocky franchise. We then go on to the next entry on this list, and that is the Predator. The chameleon-changing alien attacking Arnold Schwarzenegger's platoon of badass soldiers in the South American jungle was definitely one of the most coolest and distinctive looking villains. If you look at everything in his design, in terms of the dreadlocks, the weaponry, the mask and the skulls of his previous kills, very much handled as trophies of his conquests. The leading motivation behind his character is of course that he hunts for sport. In many ways he searches to find the ultimate adversary to challenge him, and that's a fascinating aspect to the character. We see his whole arsenal of weapons. Whilst advanced in technology, they also have this raw grittiness to indicate that the Predator has been around various planets hunting different species. We have the strength and the animalistic agility, and the most distinctive aspect is of course the ability to merge into certain backgrounds with his cloaking device. And the effects for this still look great today, and his presence drives the escalating suspense throughout the entire movie. And after the first two Alien films, the Predator represented the next truly great movie monster, which also resulted in one of the most stylish and most creative villains of the 1980s. We then go on to the next entry on this list, and that is the Joker from the 1989 Batman movie directed by Tim Burton. Played with much high energy and exhilaration by Jack Nicholson, one of the all-time great actors, without doubt is one of his most charismatic performances. And what's distinctive about Jack's version is that despite being dark and twisted and psychotic, he's also very funny, and I think that's what separates him from more recent versions with both the likes of Heath Ledger and Joaquin Phoenix. The Joker as a character overall has to have a mixture of both dark twisted psychology and comedy, as well as an unrelenting unpredictability, and I think Jack Nicholson combined all of these elements much more than any other version. Okay, so his origin is straightforward, and yes, we can criticise the choice to have him as the killer of Bruce Wayne's parents, but overall this Joker has so many iconic lines and memorable scenes, whether it's meeting with the surgeon, where we see him laughing as he comes to terms with his facial scarring. We have all of the lines, whether it's wait till they get a load of me, or dance with the devil in the pale moonlight. We have the Party Man sequence where we see Joker and his gang dancing around the museum to Prince's soundtrack, and this is certainly one of Jack Nicholson's most vivid and energetic performances, and definitely one of the best comic book movie villains of all time. We go on to the next entry on this list, and that is the Terminator. The T-800 Cyberdyne Systems Model 101, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger in James Cameron's science fiction masterpiece, still represents Arnold's most iconic role, which really began his path to superstardom within the 1980s. His role as the Terminator was very much the embodiment of the immovable object, the unrelenting killing machine that can't be reasoned or bargained with. We all know the original idea was to cast him as the movie's protagonist Kyle Reese, before a dinner conversation with James Cameron saw events change course. And what a genius decision it was, as you simply can't imagine what the movie would have been like if Arnold was cast in any other role. The sheer presence he generates whenever he appears on screen, all of the tension, backed up by Brad Fiedel's iconic music, this is what you want from any classic villain who is evil personified. And it very much laments the choice of the sequel, Terminator 2, to have a more good-natured heroic Terminator, lacking all of the menace and intensity that we see within the first film. And like all great villains, he has memorable moments, whether it's walking into the store, ordering weapons that aren't available yet. We have the standout tech noir club sequence, emphasising the real size of his threats as he looms towards Sarah Connor. And of course, we have the "I'll be back" scene, still one of cinema's most famous quotes, before we see the Terminator crashing into the police station and taking everyone out. Absolutely classic stuff, very much defining the Terminator as one of the definitive iconic villains of the 1980s. We then go on to the next entry on this list, and that is Hans Gruber from Die Hard. In 1998, what was still hard to believe that this was his debut performance in movies, Alan Rickman's brilliant performance as the leader of a criminal group taking hostages within the Nakatomi Hotel as they looked to steal millions of dollars within the building's vaults. Now here we have this personality that was much more suave, cool, ruthless and educated. In many ways, Hans Gruber is the antidote to the fiery, abrasive, wisecracking John McClane. And it's that contrast that is absolutely crucial to how successful this movie is. Hans Gruber, like John McClane, very much broke the conventions of what we typically see for a villain within an action movie. He was defined much more for his intelligence and cunning rather than his physicality. And yet he's still distinctive with his overly deliberate German accent, which almost presents a robotic, computerized tone to it, yet there is still a likeable charisma to go alongside it. Very much a defined conviction to paint this villain as somebody who is simply not to be messed around with. And again, we see this very much in the earlier scenes in his negotiation with the Nakatomi Hotel chief Takagi in trying to obtain the code from him before coldly shooting him in the head. We have the extremely funny scene where he has to deal with cokehead Selman Ellis as he tries to talk John round, unsuccessfully before Hans takes him out. We have the fantastic moment where Hans bumps into McClane for the first time and has to quickly adjust and act out a different personality, putting on an American accent under the guise of Bill Clay as one of the names that he sees from the hotel listing. And again, this just typifies the character's sharpness and how much more he's a tactician and a strategist, not simply a mindless psychopath. And so many movie fans have likened Hans Gruber to the great Bond villain that we never got, and I can completely see that all the way, and Alan Rickman likely would have delivered in that role as well. But as such, we simply have to settle with Hans Gruber being definitely one of the most game-changing iconic movie villains of the 1980s. So we then go on to the next entry on this list, and that is Khan from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Released in 1982, still for me and for a lot of Star Trek fans, the best cinematic villain of the franchise by some clear distance. The character himself did make a previous appearance in the original Star Trek series back in the 60s, but here he was much more expanded upon. We see him here lustful for revenge against Captain Kirk after he and his people were abandoned on a desolate planet for many years. And he's really much more of a theatrical, Shakespearean, classical, tragic villain with a much more sympathetic backstory. Again, not really a world killer or destroyer. He has a single focused motivation that you can understand, though at the same time it can be argued that this single mission to kill Captain Kirk proved to be his undoing for both him and also his people. And it truly is a masterful performance from the late Richard Montalban. We get so many monologues and dialogue from the character, whether it's the scene where he talks about Kirk tasking him and chasing him around the moons of Nibiru. We have the other lines where revenge is very cold and it's very cold in space. All of the great face-offs between both the US Reliant and the Enterprise in terms of the negotiation of the Project Genesis are absolutely classic. And yes, of course, we cannot go without mentioning the most memed scene probably within all of Star Trek, with Khan talking about leaving Kirk buried alive as he was left, and then Kirk responding by yelling Khan's name, full sound and fury echoing out in space. So classic, so dramatic and so intense. And Khan's dynamic with Kirk is a great example of how a villain tests and pressures the main hero, and both Montalban and William Shatner were able to create great character dynamics despite not sharing a single scene together. And Khan's presence as a villain just drives the movie all the way through. He's a very committed, intelligent and chewing the scenery all the way through. Another great iconic villain, most certainly from the decade. And we very much go from the future back to the present day for the next choice on this list, and that is Gordon Gekko from Wall Street. Very much a fabric of the time, Michael Douglas epitomises the typical corporate CEO businessman, the entrepreneur, the ruthless cutthroat, single-minded ambition, and this type of role fell right into the actor's wheelhouse, and this was during the middle of his great run of successes throughout the 1980s. And for all of his brilliant performances throughout his career, this one is certainly his most iconic. With the slick hair, the sharp suits, the hardened attitude. As people, we've probably all come across someone like Gordon Gekko within our working lives at some point, and I don't really see him as a killer or a psychotic or a destroyer. He's somebody who likes to further his own position. He has a clear-cut perspective and is disciplined, and yet is still more believable and not cartoonish or overly exaggerated. And I think his villainy comes much more from a lack of compassion or emotion or empathy. He even undermines Bud Fox, who idolises him and is very loyal, and whilst there is somewhat of a father-son or a teacher-student dynamic, Gekko really doesn't respect Bud in the same way. He really doesn't respect anybody in the same way. And like any great villain, he has so many great lines, whether it's the quoting of The Art of War, talking about the battle is won before it's even fought, whether it's all about the bucks, anything else is conversation. We have that great scene where he talks to Bud about the capitalism and the state of the country, how 1% of the wealth is hard work and 2/3 of it is inheritance or stock accumulation, how he doesn't create anything he owns. And of course we have the legendary speech, the greed is good, greed is right, greed is what works, in many ways solidifying the character's cinematic legacy. And whilst Gekko is clearly a corporate monster, it's so strange and probably so typical that he was seen as a hero, as somewhat of an inspiration, especially to many people involved within the finance industry, whether it's accountants or stockbrokers. And I think that still stands today, even in today's climate. And this is the real quality and I suppose legacy of Gekko, is that many people today still find him relevant, and that's really down to an overall masterful Oscar-winning performance from Michael Douglas, resulting without question one of the most iconic villains of the 1980s. So we then come up to the runner-up on this list, and that is General Zod from Superman 2 in 1981. Still without question one of the all-time great comic book movie villains, the leader of a trio of powerful Kryptonians who escaped capture from the first Superman movie, going back to Earth in the sequel to gain revenge on the son of the jailer Jor-El, of course who we all know as Kal-El, aka Superman. And actor Terrence Stamp is terrific in this role, a villain who is completely focused, intelligent, and as mentioned, it's great to have a compelling villain with conviction, and Zod has this complete belief in who he is and the course and his overall position. Accompanied by Ursula and Nog, we get some wonderful moments, both serious and funny, when the Kryptonians arrive on Earth, calling it Planet Houston to begin with, and coming across all of the town's people. We see them breaking into bars and also the White House and the Daily Planet. And as with all villains, we see Zod monologuing and speechifying all the way through, and he has this real mixture of a quiet assurance and also a raging intensity. And although there are many humorous moments here, Zod is not a comedic or a parody villain. Much of the humour comes from his serious reactions to both the planet and the way of life. And it's that balance between serious and humour that certainly was mastered within the first two Superman movies and sadly lost within the third and fourth ones. And of course, when it comes to legacy, we have of course the iconic line, "Kneel before Zod," then whenever you hear it, has you instantly thinking of this character whenever that line appears in any other Superman iterations. And this really is the best cinematic Superman villain, perhaps the most iconic comic book villain in terms of movies, and most definitely the best live action General Zod that we've ever got within movies or medium in general. And so then we come to the number one choice in terms of the most iconic movie villain of the 1980s, and it is very much still the undisputed choice, and that's of course Darth Vader from the Star Wars franchise. The ruthless Sith Lord enforcing the rule of the Galactic Empire makes his mark and presence primarily from the first original Star Wars trilogy, and not so much from his origin tale that what we got within the prequels. And as we're talking about the 1980s, we look at the character's arc from both The Empire Strikes Back in 1980 and also Return of the Jedi in 1983. And if we look at The Empire Strikes Back, that's when he really is the ultimate embodiment of a villain. His ongoing pursuit to drive out the rebellion and also search out his son Luke Skywalker is really the driving force of the story. Whether he's eliminating incompetent generals, who failed to carry out his orders, assigning bounty hunters, freezing Han Solo in carbonite. This is an evil villain all the way. We also get extra layers, first with him being the servant to the Emperor, and most famously, of course, the reveal of him being Luke Skywalker's father when we see them in their climactic fight. And this really is Darth Vader at his ultimate. We look at Return of the Jedi, which then saw a much more reflective and to an extent redemptive story for the character, where we deal with the inner conflict of evil and the good, and this conflict was really propelled by Luke and his ongoing desire to rescue his father from the Emperor. And Vader is probably less villainous this time round, but there's still depth to his character, especially with the Emperor being much more prominent here, and the overall conclusion to Vader's story is very satisfactory as a character progression. And despite his appearances in more recent Star Wars iterations, whether it was the scene in Rogue One or the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, it's really his role within the original trilogy that's the definitive version of the character, which still stands as so unique and distinguishable, from his appearance with his mask, the tall physical size, the black cape and the cybernetic armour, and the unmistakable robotic voice from James L. Jones. Everything about Darth Vader leaves such an impression with you. And that's why for me, I think he's still overall the most iconic Star Wars character, and still the most distinguishable and imposing villain, maybe perhaps in cinematic history, but also most definitely within the 1980s decade itself. So there's my overall thoughts and feelings and breakdown of who I deem to be the most iconic movie villains of the 1980s. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you have any other further suggestions regarding breakdowns or movies or television series or any other topics within the pop entertainment and culture scene that you'd like to see me cover, then also let me know within the comments, and I will see if I can provide further commentary for you on that subject matter within the future. Please also hit and like those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very, very soon.